Hey, kept you waiting, huh? Hi everyone. Today I wanted to talk about, well, before I get to that, something that I keep saying, or keep seeing rather, over the net are people who say, I don't like politics in my video games. And for the longest time I couldn't express exactly what these people meant, or exactly what they were against or what they were for. And when someone says, I don't want politics in my video game, what they really mean is they don't want propaganda in their video game. Because there are plenty of games that deal with political contexts and situations and themes, but the differences that people get pissed off at is when a game is telling you that a certain ideology and a certain frame of mind is superior to another, or the correct way to view the world, essentially. And so I would accrue this, or it's akin to something in the early 90s when you had every children's cartoon show focused on essentially environmentalism as the message, and it'd be very blatant and in your face. And the only cartoon that did it correctly was the Sonic AM cartoon, where they had a subtle environmental message, which was, to cue the Nostalgia Critic clip, it was, very nuanced and shocking, because it was genuine. It wasn't a forced, arbitrary, brainwashed, regurgitated thing that someone was trying to convince you of it. And this brings me into perhaps the most political game of all, which is Metal Gear Solid, which deals in political contexts and, frames of mind and the Cold War and all that stuff. But you'll realize in the Metal Gear Solid universe, it doesn't ever purport for one ideology to be greater than another. And in fact, something that's very core to the entire story of Metal Gear Solid is the theme of the individual over the ideology or over the group mentality. So this manifests even as early as Metal Gear 2, and you can play that if you have the subsistence version of Metal Gear Solid 3. And in that context, you have I forget her name, but she's a Czechoslovakian Soviet figure skater, and she talks about the difference between borders and identities and people, and she says she has these dreams and aspirations, and she says, she's kind of questioning, am I defined by my country and my allegiance to my nationality, my ideology, or am I an individual and a human being above that? And that is one of the core running themes throughout the entirety of the Metal Gear Solid series. And I just wanted to preface that kind of conversation about Metal Gear with this current conversation about, someone complaining about politics in their games, when really they just want to experience a genuine story that is universal and human and identitarian in nature, rather than a series of contrived, derivative ideas that, frankly, only appeal to the masses, And so, Metal Gear Solid, it was interesting that someone posted some kind of comment once where, video games don't ever teach you anything, especially Metal Gear Solid. And it made me realize how much Metal Gear Solid actually does teach you in some shape or form. I mean, on the most basic sense, what you do get from the Metal Gear Solid series is just streams of random trivia from Miller or Mei Ling or any of the other characters that you use on the comms over this series to give you things like stupid random facts about birds, or there's something about rats or something when you're sneaking through the vents in Shadow Moses, and I don't remember the exact. Unfortunately, it's great they give you all this trivia, but I actually don't remember any of it. Actually, no, it's coming back to me now as I'm starting to talk about the game, but It was actually at the end of Metal Gear Solid 1 where they talked about Gulf War Syndrome, and I had never heard about that before. And it's interesting how I'm not exactly sure if that was an actual thing that was specific to the Iraq or that war in the 1990s, or if it was just a new version of PTSD. And that also kind of leads into another, just a total aside, that about language. And I think, honestly, Metal Gear Solid 5 apparently deals more so with this in the 1984 style ideas of reducing and reduction and construction of language, and how truth is hidden by, I mean, I would just put it as George Carlin put it: you add more words to sensitive topics to make them seem less bad, and it's not just BS at the end of the day. So, and I think in some rant, I think George Carlin did reference the fact that, you had shell shock, which became battle fatigue, which became Gulf War Syndrome, which became post-traumatic stress disorder. And you just keep adding more and more words and intellectualize the idea or the thing to shave away from the fact of what it really is. The reality is, if you're hiding it or downplaying it by using more and more words. And I really wish I thought of this beforehand so I can link it into something in the Metal Gear Solid series, but I just realized that just now, and I have nothing to add to that, except that is a phenomenon that is very much linked to 1984. But on that point, let's link into an overview of the Metal Gear Solid series. I might go into each game more in depth individually later, but right now I'm just kind of doing a broad overview. So in Metal Gear Solid 1, I think overall the whole series is really interesting because over the course of each game you play as Snake for each and every game, but at the end of the game you actually find out what his real name is. So in Metal Gear Solid 1 his name is David, in 2 his name is Raiden, or aka Jack, and 3 it's also Jack? No, I think it's John. And so it's this interesting thing where, you have these different versions of Snake, and it's a concept and idea of essentially the super soldier, and he is a clone of the super soldier in the lore, but he's also an individual. And so Metal Gear Solid 1 is all about the genes. And I guess this must have been a big thing. I guess the CRISPR project might have been completed in the 80s, late 80s or 90s, if I recall correctly. And that was the project to essentially map the human genome. And so the entire question, and I'm going to go through each game like this, but the entire scope of Metal Gear Solid 1 is that what defines the human being, and is it the genes? And it was this whole concept where, if your genetic makeup, i.e. your nature, how you were born, is the sole determinant of what makes up a human being, what are the implications of that? And so throughout the course of that game, you do learn it in that game, where it turns out, the big twist at the end, is that you, Solid Snake, and Liquid Snake are both the subjects or offspring of L'Enfance Terrible, which is the project run in the 70s, which basically took the genetic material of the big boss from World War II, who was essentially this super soldier, post-World War II really, and they basically cloned him and tried to do different variations of his clone in order to create or recreate the same super soldier. So the entire idea is that, this project, if we can just clone this guy, we can get the exact same character out of him, essentially. And so it goes on to show that not only is it revealed that Liquid Snake is also composed of the recessive genes, but apparently all of these soldiers on Shadow Moses Island are also composed of the same genetic structure as Solid Snake. And so this entire time, as Liquid says infamously at the end of the game, that you've been killing your brothers this entire time. And it's a really interesting thing to think about, because then in that case, what differentiates people? What differentiates, it's, for example, twins, in the context, if they're made of the same genetic material, how are they different? And so there's this struggle, again, between the individual and the idea. And, the entire aspect of the fact that the Shadow Moses terrorists are ex-Foxhound units, essentially this covert op part of the American government, and they've turned against their own government. It becomes this thing of, again, ideology versus the individual, and Liquid essentially wants revenge and control for what was done to them, essentially. And so, in a very short span of a game, it's able to give you a really great scope of philosophy, honestly, and a lot of different viewpoints and perspectives that other games, I think, struggle to fit in longer scenarios. The other thing I just love about the Metal Gear Solid series in general is just all the weird mechanics Kojima can just fit in there. The fact that Snake's cigarette also acts as a mechanic where you can see the laser beams in that one section. I don't think it ever becomes useful ever again, but the fact that it is a mechanic and not just something that is just a novelty is really interesting to me. I guess personally, just on the gameplay aspect, I was never really good at Metal Gear games, because previously I played Splinter Cell, and I approached it with that mentality of, this is what a sneaking game is like, and it is absolutely not the same thing at all. I thought, I just have to stealth everywhere, but then there's certain parts of the game where you have to fight a giant tank and throw grenades into it, and I'm like, okay, well, this is not what I expected. Another aspect on Metal Gear games that I think is honestly extremely smart on Kojima's part, and why they are so popular to the extent that they are, is the way that the games are kind of scoped out in terms of plot. So a lot of the times you'll start in an area where it's very kind of realistic. I think Metal Gear 1 or Metal Gear Solid 1 kind of like fumbles this a bit, where it says, oh yeah, you're going up against these terrorists called Psycho Mantis and Vulcan Raven and all this stuff, and it kind of sounds like comic book characters. But what I like about it is more so Metal Gear Solid 2, Metal Gear Solid 3 is, this is an official, Secret Service kind of operation, a military operation, and it's only until you have someone invested in the normalcy of the situation that when it starts escalating into these weirder and weirder things where there's some guy who can suddenly fly and use telekinesis, you're not questioning it as much, because someone has already bought the scenario. They've already basically been hooked on the premise, and now they're willing to tolerate all the supernatural stuff that's going on, which I love Kojima for. The fact that he can, like, up front do a very, oh yeah, this is a cool military game, and then whip out a completely different game, a quarter of the way in is really impressive, I think. But yeah, the main struggle, especially at the end of Metal Gear Solid 1, is around, Liquid and Solid basically fighting for supremacy. And I think it's also really funny / interesting / also disinformation, where at the end of the game they have that calm thing where they admit that Liquid actually had the dominant genes, and that, I think that's a nice twist to have, but it's also technically inaccurate, because just for the fact that Liquid had blonde hair and blue eyes, those are technically actually recessive traits. That those light eyes and light hair are usually always overridden by darker hair or darker eyes in actual genetics. So Liquid seemed to be more technically correct, but in any case. And so they have this, struggle atop, Metal Gear, where they're basically fighting shirtless in this epic one-on-one fight. And so it becomes a question of, are we defined by our nature? And you kind of have this final speech at the end of the first game where, I think it depends if you save Otacon or Meryl or something, it's different who's narrating it. But in the ending I got, Meryl's narrating that, David, you have to live for today. You have to live for the now and for the person that you are today, because despite your nature, despite how you were raised or how you were treated, you still are an individual. Even if you are a clone, you still have the ability or the vocation, essentially, to pursue your own happiness. And so it's kind of interesting how Metal Gear Solid 1 ends like that, because it seems like that could have just been it. Like, there didn't need to be a sequel where he essentially decides to, ride off into the wilderness of Alaska and live his life as however he see fit. And then I think there are a bunch of other things I could mention and bring up about, the reoccurring theme of, the weak scientist like Hal Emmerich, or the cybernetic tortured ninja of Gray Fox, who is kind of symbolic of the soldiers who are kind of fed through the grinder and just only understand pain as their main motive of being, essentially. But I think that kind of finishes off Metal Gear Solid 1 in terms of just not being defined by one's nature, but also understanding one's nature. So it's all about the genes and how technology is going to also impact our genetics, and will, with CRISPR, we're able to sequence it, and eventually this whole idea of designer humans and designer babies is kind of a thing that has been talked about, but actually hasn't happened yet. But again, something that Kojima's always been on the pulse of, like, the latest technology ever since, like, the 90s, and has always been very interested in what, or rather how, technology will impact society and the implications of it, and also the deterrent to the collapse of meaning in that technological advancement, which right now we're dealing with things like AI taking away people's purpose and jobs and vocations. And even Elon Musk said something about this, where he said the biggest threat to humanity in the next few decades is the fact that many people are going to be replaced with AI. And it's he says, everyone can and has to serve a purpose. It's just the time between getting them from their old job to their new job where they can actually exert that purpose and find themselves. And it's a very humanistic point. I didn't really expect from Mr. Musk, frankly, to kind of be very humanistic and very compassionate, and not just be like, yeah, we're darting ahead with AI and rockets and Tesla trucks and whatever, and we're leaving humans behind and becoming a transessential being or whatever. So he actually did show some kind of compassion and humanity in there, and I think Kojima definitely echoes that all throughout his work. Again, it's about the individual overcoming their identity and their group and whatnot. And that kind of leads us into Metal Gear Solid 2, which is my absolute favorite game of the Metal Gear series. Probably one of my top 10, maybe my top number 5th game of all time. And I will admit that in terms of gameplay, it's definitely not the strongest. I actually kind of don't like the soundtrack that much, besides the main theme. But what I love about it, Metal Gear Solid 2, just in the way its story is revealed, is that it always leaves you second guessing exactly what is going on and what is reality. Because while Metal Gear Solid 1 was about the genes, Metal Gear Solid 2, Sons of Liberty, is about the means. And so, I think this was potentially, there's a lot of media that was, I feel, influenced by Richard Dawkins' book, The Human Meme or something. I forget exactly what it was called. But Richard Dawkins was actually an atheist, and he created this idea of a meme. And so the meme itself, what it actually is an infectious idea that acts as a gene. It's an idea so compelling and so stubbornly reproductive in people's minds that it acts as like a genetic piece of information. And So it's like if a piece of DNA was actually mental, what would that look like? And so a lot of people today kind of associate memes with jokes online or expressions or phrases, which are technically true. And in a very technical sense, any idea is technically a meme. The only requirement it needs is that it's addictive and many people regurgitate it and bring it up in conversation, and it exists. You could say technically, classic mythology and stories are memes, and how they flow from one culture to another, whether through adaptation or direct interpretation, is a meme. For example, you could argue that Jupiter, the god, is a meme. The Jupiter was the Romanized version of a Greek god, Zeus. And then you could even argue, I think, further to that in some aspects of the Old Testament God or New Testament God, that Zeus and Jupiter is also present in that version, as the Romans, in their description of Jupiter, adopted the Christian mythology and transformed it. They inadvertently, regardless of whatever I think anyone wants to say, even though it was a Greek, Aramaic. I mean, people don't want to say it's Jewish Christianity, but there's multiple things in that pot in the Middle East at that time that to say it was just Jewish is kind of a weird simplification. The New Testament is written in Greek. The people at the time, Jesus, I believe, spoke Aramaic. There were a lot of different cultures that were all mixed in that area, which makes sense because it's technically the center of the world. So, anyway, the point is that memes ideas get adopted, implemented, and transformed over a series of time. The Roman Empire, from when it started to when it fell, a Roman citizen and someone who identified as a Roman was very different from the beginning to the start. Someone who identifies as an American in the 1776 versus 2024 is two very different people. And so it's interesting how similar to genes, memes and ideas and ideas of nations and individuals and identities evolve constantly and are in a constant mode of change and mixture. And so it's this idea of the memetic self that permeates Metal Gear Solid 2. And what I love about it, again, is that when you start the game, you're playing as Snake. And when you actually start the game, you are playing as the real Snake, and you go on this tanker mission, and immediately following that, as the tutorial level and the intro level, you start to play as a masked character who's also in scuba gear like the first game, but he takes off his mask, and it turns out there's this blonde guy called Raiden, and he still goes by the codename Snake, and he says, oh yeah, the tanker mission, that was one of my favorite VR missions. And so Kojima begins this whole thing where he was really obsessed with this for a while. It really came to fruition in Metal Gear Solid 4 later. This idea that simulations, and specifically video games, would actually act as ways of training people on things like real-life war scenarios, that people would have their consciousness and their being transformed through virtual simulations. If you can make a scenario that is so real that it is like real life, how can you say that it's any less real than actually doing it? And that's more so a thing in Metal Gear Solid 4, where everyone is at that point trained on VR missions that are so apparently realistic that they think they've been in real wars. But anyway, back to Metal Gear Solid 2. What I love about it is the ambiguity that you're playing as Snake, you're playing as Raiden as well, but there's also another Snake who's now called Pliskin, which, I don't think anyone needs to know this. It's been repeated to death, but all the Metal Gear, or at least the character of Solid Snake, is based off Snake Plissken from the Escape from New York and Escape from LA movies, which are, they're okay. They're okay movies. They're not the best, but I think Kurt Russell, Kojima just saw him and I guess just fell in love. I just like, that's the guy. But yeah, not only are you unsure as the player whether or not Raiden is actually Snake or the real Snake, whether if Shadow Moses, as he says, is just a VR mission, if it messes up the timeline and retroactively makes everything totally fake. And it was interesting, though, because I think there was, I don't want to say DLC, but there was like an after or like an extra disc or something for Metal Gear Solid 1, which allowed you to do VR missions. And they've always had that as a trope in all the games, where the VR missions are just like basically DLC. Where you basically have these extra missions where you're in this virtual place. None of the things are really textured that much, and it's just like these scenarios where you sneak around to take out a bunch of guards in this pattern. It's just for the purpose of extending gameplay, frankly. But again, Kojima works it into the lore so that they say, yes, well, this is how we trained Raiden to be Solid Snake. So the whole idea and premise is that Raiden has become Solid Snake just through VR missions. And that all has become challenged to the point where he's in a real mission now, and he's using all the things he's learned from VR, and he doesn't have any personal experience whatsoever. And the idea is, will that make the best soldier possible? Is it, in Metal Gear Solid 1, it was like, well, if we can just clone him with the genes, then we can get the best soldier possible. And in Metal Gear Solid 2, it says, well, if we can just train him with the exact same scenarios, we don't need the same DNA. We can turn anyone, essentially, into the perfect soldier. And so it's a shift from nature over to nurture. And so this is the main theme of Metal Gear Solid 2. What I love about it is it works on multiple layers of narrative, in that at a certain point in the game, you start to wonder, or I think it's near the end of the game, actually, where they literally confront you, and they kind of say that this entire mission that you've been doing on the big shell is actually not real. That what you're experiencing right now is a VR mission. And I love that storytelling, where suddenly you have to question everything that you've been through, where your current reality and experience, this video is all an illusion. I'm just an illusion. What's really going on? And there's a higher story and narrative taking place that is beyond our purview. And I mean, just in a nutshell, that's why I love Metal Gear Solid 2, because the story is so interesting. There's a lot of things I don't like about it. I don't like that a lot of the boss battles just involve random angry saxophones. I don't like really the aesthetic of the big shell. I don't like the fact that you can't really backtrack to certain areas once they've been blown up. And just the whole story, like just the whole escort mission with Emma Emmerich, there's just a bunch of things that, the mission where you have to go around finding the C4 and then freezing it around Big Shell. There's just so many things about this on a gameplay level I don't really enjoy, that I do agree with people it makes it the weakest Metal Gear game. But the story totally, the narrative totally makes up for it, 100%. And because of that, it's my favorite Metal Gear game. And I think the big thing that people talk about is at the end of the game, which honestly, I played it, I kind of got it, and then I totally forgot about it until someone did a YouTube analysis, which has been, I think it's called the most profound moment in video games, and it really is. And I wouldn't say it's the most profound, but it's profound and the most relevant. And this is where the whole Kojima train takes a interesting derailment into reality land, where it's one thing to look at a piece of media and fiction and be like, okay, that's cool to think about, and there's another level where you're like, oh, that's actually too relevant, that's actually like extremely relevant, that's actually like a little bit uncomfortable how relevant it is, where it's telling you something that you should already know but you don't want to admit to yourself. And what that is the final scene in Metal Gear Solid 2, where it turns out that the Colonel Campbell that you've been talking to this entire time, including Rose, I believe, and the whole correspondence that you've been using to save your game and basically conduct yourself through the entire experience, turn out to be all AIs. They're all fake, reconstructed from the VR missions from Shadow Moses. And so the AIs basically revealed themselves, saying, yeah, we are AIs. And of course what happens over the course of the game is that, there's this thing where the president is ransomed for like $1 billion or something. They take over Big Shell and the environmental, depot, and basically they're holding everyone hostage unless they, blow up the cleaning facility and whatever. And so the other thing is that they have to stop this thing called Arsenal Gear, which is this giant fortress which houses one of these massive AIs, which the Patriots use to control the world and America. And so this is where it goes into kind of conspiracy land, where it's the idea that the president himself, who is one of the captives on the Big Shell, doesn't control America at all. That is actually run by a shadow organization of a small group of men called the Patriots. And they're using AI and these highly advanced digital machines to essentially control society, the economy, the market, the media, everything, and control the world entirely from the shadows. And the whole presidency is just another part of their sham and their game. And so when the AIs that have been commanding and controlling Biden reveal themselves and reveal that they've been manipulating him this whole time, that none of this was actually a real military op, what they also reveal is how this AI works to control humanity. And so while it says things like, yeah, of course we rig the stock market, we rig elections, we rig everything, what's very interesting is how they say they rig the social context. And this is something I guess isn't really talked about a lot, but what they basically said is that the way they've been shaping the internet is to make it seem organic the way it is evolving, but really in their designs, what they want to emerge is an ability to create and control context. That's really it, honestly. They want to create context. And so their whole point is that when you see a headline or piece of news or information, it's the connotation associated with that and the way it's written that shapes the public consciousness. And if you want to go back to, I think, the beginning of this, I would go back to, I think it's Edward Bernays, who essentially was Sigmund Freud's nephew, I believe. And he was an American marketing guru, essentially, during the post-war era in the 50s. And the TLDR is that he basically, at the time, like oats and cereals were becoming super popular in urban centers, and as people moved to the cities more, they didn't have time to make a full breakfast. And so the traditional industries of egg, dairy, bacon, etc. were losing huge market share. It was actually a huge cultural shift that not only were people moving into the cities, but they were also consuming more grains and oats rather than the traditional farm-based breakfast styles. And this was a huge shift in culture, along with urbanization, meant that your diet changed and your economics changed drastically as well. And so what Edward Bernays did is he came in, and the way that he said, okay, the way I'm gonna save the traditional breakfast of eggs, bacon, whatever, is the way we're gonna market this is not through commercials, but through like indirect marketing, which is essentially that their marketing budget was to go to the Washington Post or the local newspaper or whatever and pay them to print articles about studies of things that scientists and dietitians and nutritionists were saying about breakfast. I think at the time they called it small breakfast and big breakfast as the weird terminology, and the big breakfast was the eggs and bacon and everything. And so they're saying, oh, well, people have more energy when they eat a proper, eggs and bacon and everything. And, I think that's actually technically true, but regardless of whether or not, of whatever, they essentially marketed bacon and eggs via, articles and studies in the newspaper as things that weren't telling you directly, hey, go buy bacon and eggs at your local Loblaws or whatever for like, half price off. They weren't advertising groceries. They were influencing people through indirect means, and this turned out to be a huge success. That, oh well, the newspaper, and so said that eggs and bacon are actually very good for you, and and they didn't need to have an advertisement for their local supermarket or their grocery store. They were able to just think, oh, I should go and buy that stuff and get away from cereal and all these other oats and whatever. And so I think that's definitely true. I think, like, unless I'm being psyoped here, I think eggs and bacon are kind of superior to cereals and oats and stuff. But again, despite that, what gains popularity isn't always the best for people. And so whether or not it was because it was genuinely good or because of that marketing campaign that didn't appear as a marketing campaign, it really shifted people back to traditional breakfasts, essentially. Anyway, but back to Metal Gear Solid 2, the whole point of that is that the Patriots and the Patriot AI system is saying, we don't need to tell people what to think, and we don't have to be 1984 and control people's minds and brainwash them. We just have to create the ability for people to express themselves that allows the context to appear. So it's not that there's a war and the war is bad. It's like saying, well, scientists are saying, that the amount of casualties in this part of the world due to this war is, so and so. And so instead of saying war bad, you just paraphrase it in a different way and kind of make it more scientific and intellectual. And I mean, there's multiple ways to do this, but the general idea, again, that the Campbell AI that's all gone rogue and skeleton-y-ish on you is basically just repeating this point that we don't have to brainwash people and tell them what to do. We just make the context and the social area in which they come to their own conclusions that we are leading them to. So it's the idea of indirect confrontation and indirect narratives that lead people to the conclusions that the Patriots wanted them to come to in the first place. And it's not through a totalitarian, we are going to, you must pull out your trash at 7 p.m. or you will be shot and fined or something. It's not a totalitarian, brute force method of enforcing dogmas and rules and restrictions. It's basically fooling people and tricking them into coming to the conclusions that you've already established for them to go into. So this whole video and that video and that section of the game, I think, is way more true today than it is now, where people are realizing that essentially the media just lies. And I don't think, I don't know if that's a controversial thing to say now or 5 years from now or 5 years ago, but it seems to me that the structure and the fabric of reality, or of society rather, is more and more based on lies and intellectualizing of bad ideas to make them more palatable to the public, and then gaslighting into everyone into thinking that that is how it normally is, which it's not. Let's say you wanted everyone to go out and buy a Mitsubishi for some reason. You wouldn't run an ad for Mitsubishi as the traditional companies would. If you were working at this level in cultural shift and adaptation as the Patriots were, you would instead make a bunch of articles about people being, saying Toyota or Ford or whatever, all their brakes are failing and people have been in these horrible car accidents, and you'd run a news article about this one family, not a group, but of this one family that was horrifically killed in this awful, awful accident because they were in a Ford or a Honda truck or something, and the brakes failed. And then at the end of it, they say, "Oh well, Mitsubishi, has a nice, new model out," and that's how you basically would market it. And so the whole structure and narrative of changing public consciousness came to a point where it was so intellectualized and advanced that it became all-encompassing, where again, you're not being forced at gunpoint to do anything. You're just being overtly gaslighted by these advanced systems and notions and narratives that surround you and you're immersed in. And because you're immersed in it, you don't even realize it, like a fish in water. Anyway, that's kind of an intense, reading and interpretation of it. But that's it. That's it. What Metal Gear Solid 2 is getting at the core. And again, they talked about how memes will shape culture. I don't know if I can do another video on it, but it's just interesting how certain pieces of media in the early 2000s really talked a lot about memes as an emerging idea. I think the earliest one I can find, and maybe a book that I frankly would actually like to get into and read, is a book called Similarities and Simulacrum by some French guy, some French philosopher in the 1970s. And I only know about this book because it is the book that Neo takes out in The Matrix as one of the books in his room. Or maybe it's on his shelf or something, but like when the director has a full camera shot that pauses for almost a second on a piece of media or a book in a movie, they're kind of telegraphing to you that this is what inspired them, or one of the main ideas and concepts for that piece of media. So I'd really actually like to read that eventually someday. I don't think 1970s French philosophy would be easy to read, which is my only I don't really want to get into that. Plus, I feel like they'd be explaining what we already kind of know what memes are, and then like 10% of it are going to be something like, oh, I didn't think of that. So The Matrix, in a way, talks about memes. It talks about replications of ideas. Metal Gear Solid 2, obviously. Trying to think of other things. I can't think of anything on top of my head since I've just been immersed in Metal Gear right now. But obviously, I mean, I'm kind of jumping ahead, but Metal Gear Rising definitely deals with this implicitly. They literally say, memes and, the meme of despair or whatever. Red Mist. I forgot the guy's name. Whatever he says, he basically talks about the memes, Jack, the memes, and that essence is echoed in that game. More so specifically at the very end with Armstrong and that confrontation. Armstrong launches this terrorist attack on an American military base in Afghanistan, claiming it's insurgents and the usual suspects, and Raiden is like, oh, you destroyed this military base, and then Armstrong says, no, that's not what social media is saying. And so he brings up all these articles saying, oh, America, it's time to go back to war and attack Afghanistan, the Middle East, and and continue our imperialistic doctrine in this part of the world. And so Armstrong basically launches a false flag attack on this base in order to secure his voters and his power and the emotional galvanization to essentially do what he wants. So he launches an attack on his own base so that the people support him to increase the war economy and do his invasion. I'm kind of jumping ahead, but you can see how the memes and the restructuring of the social fabric is essentially possible. So what they talked about in Metal Gear Solid 2, you don't really see an example of that until Metal Gear Solid Rising, where it literally happens at the end of the game as almost like a callback, but also like Kojima's like, oh, by the way, remember that thing that I talked about? This is how it actually works. There's a legitimate, albeit fictional, example in the same universe of the implementation of the ideas they were talking about in the second game. Anyway, and the way Metal Gear Solid 2 kind of finally ends is you have David, Snake, and Raiden, Jack, Snake, meet in New York City. And by the way, I love that end scene for Metal Gear Solid 2, how you fight on top of the I forget what the building's called, the Washington Monument or something, and it just is. I think it's just so unfortunately rare that in North America we don't have extremely distinct structures and buildings. I mean, we have very modern-ish buildings, but I just love how distinct that building is. How you have this statue of George Washington. And I kind of freaked out, honestly, when I did visit New York and I did see that building. And I forgot about Metal Gear Solid 2, but when I saw it, I'm like, oh, that's the place. and it was really fun just actually visiting there. And for those of you who don't know, that building, which I can't remember the name of, is right on basically the corner of Wall Street and I think Main Avenue. I don't know, but it's on Wall Street for sure. And I think it's a courthouse. I'm not actually sure. But it's this really epic final fight between, Raiden and Solidus. And I didn't even mention Solidus, who was the late or early project in L'Enfance Terrible, where in the case of, Solid Snake and Liquid Snake, they were made using different sets of genes, and they had to separate, again, the recessive from the dominant and these other things, while Solidus is a direct replica copy of Big Boss. And so Raiden kind of has this thing where what was it? He was adopted, I think. I remember Raiden is from Liberia, which is the American colony in Africa. But oh god, there's bugs all over here. But I don't remember precisely what his deal was. I know he was adopted or something. So the closest thing he has to a father figure is, I guess, the Big Boss, and so that's why Solidus kind of technically is this kind of father-son struggle / relationship. But anyway, you defeat Solidus in the epic, samurai sword battle on top of an American national monument. And Snake and Raiden are talking, in the middle of downtown, and you have stock footage. I love when Kojima uses stock footage of real events. I don't know why. It just makes me giddy. It's so stupid. And so they're basically discussing, again, David is kind of giving the message to Raiden that he got in Metal Gear Solid 1, which is that you need to live for yourself. He's like, you still have time. They don't know this yet, I guess, but in the chronologically next game, Metal Gear Solid 4, Snake ages rapidly, and basically his time is kind of coming to an end, which is also technically because Kojima didn't want to work on Metal Gear Solid anymore. He wanted to do something else, and Konami was like, no. So he just made him old, out of spite, kind of. But again, Snake is giving Raiden the same kind of talk where he's saying, look, you need to live for yourself. You need to explore the world and embrace the world. And regardless, you know your nature. You know that you were born in Liberia. You know your history. But what you don't know is your own mind. Are you composed by the experiences and the nurture that you experience more than your nature? And so, despite all the VR training you've been through, despite all of the, the missions you've gone on, all the lies you've been told, is Rose even real? All of these lies you've been told, despite all that, you still have your youth and your life ahead of you, and you can still embrace that and live a life that isn't just an epic cyborg super soldier. That is what he decides to do. But, he could have become like an accountant on Wall Street or something, I don't know. But he's like, you can still live your life. You don't have to be confined and constrained to the ideas and the memetics that the patriots in the world have crafted for you. You can still be an individual above everything. And again, this is the same theme that goes back even to the original Metal Gear games, where it's the individual rising above their nationality, their identity, their ideology, and having an identity that is more distinct, more purposeful, and more unique than the hive mind of society that how it wants you to identify with group A or group B, and say you're part of no group, but you are yourself. And that is, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, self-actualization, the Jungian principle of, going through, the process of awakening to the higher self, the whole persona tarot card thing where you go from the fool all the way to, the world and all the stages of life to become, again, a newer version of yourself through the alchemical method of transforming, coal to gold, and, that is the version of the internal manifestation revolution that you go through, that you go towards a higher state of being in this context. And that, in less eloquent words, is what Snake says to Raiden. And that's basically Metal Gear Solid 2. And again, I love that game because it just messes with you intellectually so hard. Especially, my favorite part is the end part. Despite Raiden being naked and it being incredibly just awkward to play that, I feel like Kojima's tempting our homophobia or our homosexuality or something in that scene. With this twink somersaulting with groping his balls. But regardless of all that, what I love about that sequence is not only every time you call Campbell, he gives you the most deranged, off-the-wall, insane dialogue I love to listen to. Like, it could be everything from Raiden, the mission is a failure, turn off your PlayStation 2 immediately and delete the memory card. Or you say, I'm a giant caterpillar, soon I will become a butterfly, I have to munch, 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 munch. Something like that. It was just this total mind F, where you're just like okay, everything is just off the walls now. This guy I thought I knew is actually a demented AI. The other thing I absolutely love is the fact that when you're in that final section, it really threw me for a loop. It was almost like a Eternal Darkness, where you're doing the final sequence and you're doing the final fight with Snake, and you have the samurai sword, which is super cool, and you're taking down all the guys and this rising elevator, and then suddenly it's like game over. And when you get the game over screen, it makes the main screen kind of like in the corner. It says game over, but unlike a normal game over, that little screen doesn't stop. You actually keep fighting inside that screen, and if you keep fighting, it returns to gameplay. But literally, the game itself is attacking you and trying to make you stop. The AI within the game and Campbell are trying to stop you. It's so cool. It's so cool. I think Metal Gear Solid 2 is the best in the series, just because of how much it messes with the player, and as arrogant as it sounds, is the most intellectual of all the games. I really, really like it. But moving on now is the fan favorite, Metal Gear Solid 3. So 3 is a game I maybe was a little bit let down by, because everyone said 3 was their favorite. 3 was the best in the series. And I just came off of 2. I'm like, okay, cool. Well, let's see what's going on. And 3 was, everyone's biggest complaint is they really hated Raiden. I really didn't mind him. I was just like, okay, he's fine. He's not Snake. Snake is definitely cooler, but the story kind of makes up for it. But people were really disappointed. They really wanted Solid Snake back. So they brought him back in the form of the original Big Boss. And this is where we're starting to get a lot more lore, and we're starting to learn a lot more about what's really going on. And basically, if you want to really understand the history of Metal Gear Solid, you just need to understand one character, and that is Revolver Ocelot. Or in this game, I think his name is Adam, I believe. Yeah, they reveal his name at the end too, in this big kind of reveal, along with this Snake being called John. But Metal Gear Solid 3, I don't know, it was kind of like okay to me, because I feel like there were some ideas it had which were really interesting, but kind of failed to deliver sometimes. It felt definitely more like an action movie, but no, regardless of that. That being said, I am kind of very interested to see Metal Gear Solid Delta, or whatever it's called, which is the HD remake of 3. I'm not really going to play it, obviously, but I'm really excited for people to experience it and play it, and also see what kind of new little mechanics they add to it. So the main idea besides, or inside 3, is, again, the individual versus their duty, I would say. So we've had genes, memes, and then duty. And duty is an interesting concept here, because one's duty can sometimes go beyond their nationality and their ideology. And so it's almost like duty, or if you want to put it in another way, your will is in conflict with all these other identities. And so the basic premise of Metal Gear Solid 3 is it's during the Cold War. It has a little bit of a James Bond-ish vibe to it. The Major definitely makes references to that IP, throughout the codec calls. And so even though, it's, in the past, they have way more mechanics, and obviously this is the third game of the series. And so the main premise and the main story and plot point is that one of the heroes of the World War II battlefield that the Americans had fighting for them was this woman called the Boss. And so she essentially becomes the mother of all the special forces units, and so she was this legendary soldier, despite being a woman, who essentially entered in on the battlefield and gave birth essentially to what was considered to be, the next kind of generation of super soldiers. And so they also, and forgive me because this is the one part where I didn't play Peace Walker, so apparently this piece is a lot more, it's the only Metal Gear game I haven't played, besides Acid, where essentially the Boss was part of L'Enfance Terrible, where she had to give surrogate birth to a bunch of different children essentially that would be used to replicate her. And I don't actually remember this part, but the big boss, I believe, is her son or her surrogate son. Okay, well, I just looked up. According to Google, he was just an apprentice. There was no genetic similarity there. I kind of swear there was something else. Maybe Google's not helping me. But in any case, the boss, the big boss, or soon to be big boss, in this case he's Naked Snake, essentially sees the boss as his mentor and also as his mother figure. And it's a very interesting dynamic where you have this character who is your superior, but I guess this is true in other military contexts, but I guess you have a bunch of young guys who are privates entering the military. They might come from bad backgrounds, or they don't have a stable family unit, and they see their lieutenant or their commander as kind of like a father figure, because he's the one who's going to straighten them out and give them that kind of fatherly structure in their life. But here it's a maternal aspect, but it's a maternal aspect despite, even though she's a soldier. So it's like a harsh maternal love. That is the context for which this game takes place in, and that's a really unique scenario. And so I've been wrapping up to this, I'm sorry, but what happens is the boss pretends to defect to the Soviet Union. She associates with these renegades who basically want to take over the Soviet Union, or are these insiders, and basically they launch a prototype handheld nuclear device in the Snevergorast forest or swamp or something in western Russia, in a totally remote area. But the nuclear explosion triggers reading for both the Soviets and the Americans, and basically in order to smooth out relations, the idea is they have to send in the Naked Snake essentially to take out the boss as proof to the Soviets from the Americans that they didn't have anything to do with it, and that they're going to identify this rogue group within the Soviet structure and bring them to justice, and by bringing them the body of their highest soldier. Apparently, in the political world of Metal Gear Solid, that is sufficient evidence for them to be like, okay, fine, we'll let you off the hook. And so Solid Snake, or Naked Snake rather, is signed into this mission to basically kill and defeat his own mentor. And so it's a very cool setup. It's really, really nifty. Again, I'm trying to remember exactly why the boss defected to the Soviet Union. I think she had some giga-brain plan where her main speech is about making the world whole. The whole idea that, East versus West and everything, and the borders disappear once you realize we're all humans. And it's very interesting, and I've thought about this game many times, but I never realized that the intro is very similar to Metal Gear Solid 1 in the sense that you're confronted with Master Miller, and he has all these really cool, interesting codec calls, and you have all these codec calls with the boss at the outset of Metal Gear Solid 3 on the Virtuous mission, where she talks about borders. She talks about how the world is divided and she wants to make it whole, and that essentially that there's no such thing as an eternal enemy. There's only the times that change and the powers that shift, and then suddenly one enemy just changes to another enemy. And I think that's very true if I think about kind of the end of World War II, where it's very strange that the Americans allied themselves with the Russians simply because they both wanted to defeat Germany and make sure they didn't triumph as an economic power or whatever during the war and win World War II. So it was an alliance of like the enemy of my enemy. It was an alliance of convenience, essentially, of necessity. Even though the Americans and the Soviets had completely opposite ideologies, they still aligned just to make sure they took out the Germans. And so once that did happen, though, immediately after the war, they realized, so who's our main threat now? Well, it's the Russians. And once they realized that, they then realized, oh crap, we have to turn our previous ally into an enemy. And suddenly it's a huge 180. And even at the Yalta Accords, you have, I forget, it was Roosevelt and Stalin and whoever, and I think the French Prime Minister all meeting and essentially making the conditions of the end of the war. But it's this very odd series of pictures where they're realizing, okay, cool, we stopped the war, but now are we enemies? ? And so you have the Americans and the Soviets kind of socializing, kind of realizing in the back of their minds that for the next 50 to 70 years they're going to be mortal enemies when they're still acting as allies. And it's this kind of funny social situation, if you could boil it down to that. And of course they were totally terrified in the post-war period. What if the Soviets get a nuke? What if they steal our technology? What if they steal German scientists? What if they steal, etc., etc.? But the point is that every alliance is an alliance of convenience, or at least it was in that case. And so what the boss is saying is that there's no such thing as an eternal enemy. It's only the times that change and the powers and the perception of power. And so that's kind of what she's saying. And so her whole philosophy is that it's all BS, that it's all fake, and the only real thing to do is to make the world whole. So if I recall correctly, she basically made sure that Volgan shot that nuke on purpose in order to create the situation wherein the Americans and the Russians had to cooperate. And I think that was what she was driving at, and what her ultimate overall plan was, even if it would result in her death. And so it's really interesting at the end of the game where, and I just love little nuances, the fact that when you fight the big boss, or when you fight the boss rather, the weapon you use to kill her is called the Patriot. And so it's interesting that the boss is not only dying for the safety of her country, but also the safety of the Soviet Union. She's dying for the cause of humanity, and in order to make sure that the world can be at peace and that nuclear war and devastation can be averted. And the bitter irony and bittersweetness of it is that the person who has to pull the trigger is the one person she probably cares about most, her basically adopted son, basically, Naked Snake, John. And he's put in a position where he has to make the ultimate sacrifice on her behalf, where he has to kill the one person that he cares about most, that she put in motion. And so it's this amazingly emotional end sequence where you have to kill her, and her main thing is that you need to finish your mission because you are a patriot. And so it's this amazing character shift where Big Boss, when we go from Naked Snake to Big Boss, we see the difference of these two characters. And Big Boss, for the rest of the series, is ostensibly the antagonist until you realize that he's fighting against the Patriots this whole time. And so it's after this critical moment where Naked Snake realizes that they're just pawns in this sick game of this power structure, and that, again, the illusion of borders and societies are only constructed for the sake of dividing people and dividing humans from truly knowing each other, and also dividing people from peace, and in order to perpetuate a war economy, to perpetuate the power and control of fear that during this time the politicians that were in power and the power structure were at an all-time high in terms of control, because they could contort and move the people based on the fear of the Soviet Union, the fear of nuclear weapons, the fear of the American imperialism. On both sides, they saw themselves as incredibly imperialistic powers, which was technically true, but they also abused that power to fully control the people and create dissension and demonization on both parties, and an aspect of social control that they really reveled in. And when Snake realizes this, and he wakes up to it, and he realizes that the boss is sacrificing herself to destroy this higher structure of these two organisms that essentially have aligned themselves in this fake struggle. When Snake realizes that and he has to execute the boss, that's when he becomes the big boss. And it's, again, additionally ironic that even though he's promoted within the American bureaucracy to a higher position than the boss, he then in turn becomes far more treacherous and far more ideologically aligned with the person that he killed after that event. And so the whole broad scope is that, at the end of the game, you have this amazing scene where the boss salutes, the big boss salutes the boss, and realizes that she was a true patriot that died for her country. And that is what the words say, but I think what actually is missing, and maybe wasn't fully compounded upon, is the fact that the boss didn't die for the United States of America. She didn't die for the Soviet Union. She died for a higher cause, for the unification of the world and the dissolution of borders. And what does the big boss go on to establish? Militaire sans frontières, the military without borders. And so it's an amazing story. It's really, really cool, where again, Kojima has linked back all the way back to Metal Gear. It was Metal Gear 2, by the way, with that ice skater, where it's all about the individual overcoming the systems of control and the structures of society. It's the individual versus the brainwashing and the socialization attempts. And speaking of socialization, I don't want to get too much into it, but Ted Kaczynski talked a lot about that in Just for Society and its future. And it's really interesting because I won't go too much into it, but essentially the gist of Kaczynski's work is that it's not just that technology is inherently bad, that is one point, but the immediate point that he spans a lot of time on is that technology is going to be used to enforce socialization. It's not just that technology takes away your power process and your independence and your ability to navigate within society, whether it's the right wing or left wing or whatever, but it's the fact that society will use technology to impose social conditioning on you, and nature, or rather nurture, will overtake nature, where the memes will become stronger than the genes, wherein an example is, you don't want to vote correctly or do this government program, we're going to disable your bank account. We're going to use all of these aspects. We're going to turn off your electricity. We're going to turn off your water. We're going to turn you back into the Stone Age. And most people will comply. As urbanization has increased, urbanization is co-associated with the idea of technology and technification and systems of control. And I mean, I love living in the city, but I do recognize the threat that Kaczynski, and I guess by extension Kojima, is extrapolating upon in his games. And so it's really interesting how Metal Gear Solid 3 kind of ends, because it's kind of hard to wrap your head around this fact that at the end of Metal Gear Solid 3, Big Boss becomes the main antagonist of the series. And so he leads a rogue military group, essentially. And maybe I'll just jump to Metal Gear Solid 5 now instead of 4, because there's, in the timeline, it makes more sense. And so he establishes this military without borders, where they're not a country. They're a group of soldiers who are fighting for their personal liberty and freedom. So it's kind of like America, but like to such an intense degree that they don't even have a governing system. They literally have a general as their leader. They don't even have a king. They have like Big Boss. And so I think it's interesting, because when I saw this, and I saw Metal Gear Solid 5, I thought a lot about there's a series of documentaries. The only one you should watch is Addio Africa, which is an Italian production based in the 1960s and 70s about Africa, how it was going through decolonization, a bunch of very bloody revolutions. And so you had a lot of Western European colonies that were becoming independent. You also had quite a few Islamic countries and regimes in Africa that I didn't even know about. Like apparently Angola, I want to say, used to be Islamic, and they just like massacred and genocided a lot of the settlers, including the Muslims in that area. It was really interesting to see South Africa, because that was a combination of, well, it did gain independence, but it was a combination of British, Dutch, Indian, and of course native African Zulus. I'm not sure what their ethnicity is, but South, sub-Saharan Africans. And so there was a mixture of all these different groups, and they eventually, gained their independence from, the UK. It's funny, if you want to look at the number of countries that have an Independence Day that is from the United Kingdom in the world, it is most of them. It's kind of insane to look at that. Almost every country, you think America, Independence Day, July 4th, whatever, is, this one unique thing. But no, almost every country in the world has Independence Day, and it is all from Britain, because Britain just ate everything. But anyway, in that documentary, Audio Africa, it talks about a series of mercenary groups, of a combination of disillusioned soldiers who no longer felt that fighting for their country was in the best interest. You had, they wouldn't be Vietnam vets, but I guess Nam soldiers who saw that, well, I didn't want to fight for America's imperialistic interests in, Asia or the Middle East or Africa or whatever. And you have these band, what they call soldiers of fortune, where they literally become mercenaries because they realize that to fight in the military, or they have fought in the military, they no longer are reliant on them, and they realize that they do have a certain set of skills that they can fight, and they can die and struggle essentially, and they have all the skills necessary to run a military, but they don't want to be part of either the bureaucracy. Maybe the military was run poorly, but on an ideological level, they wanted to separate and sever themselves from the idea of the nation state. They wanted to pursue their own individualistic liberty, and in a way, it's a very American ideal, that you don't want to be controlled by kings or nations or countries, that you are literally fighting and dying on your own dollar. And so you have these interviews with these mercenaries who, some of them are ex-SS officers fighting along, French legionaries, ex-SAS guys, and they're all just this collection of soldiers that are literally, all they know is how to fight and how to die and how to wage war, and they're doing it on their own dollar and reaping the apparent rewards of that. And so that kind of scenario of all these crazy, insane proxy wars taking place in Africa and the Middle East, I think, and that are being fought primarily by mercenaries that are funded by both the Americans and the Russians, is kind of the context and inspiration, I think, which leads to Metal Gear Solid 5 and the whole construction of, Mother Base. And so Metal Gear Solid 5, you play as Venom Snake, and so you make this giant floating base in international waters off the Seychelles island, which I think is off the coast of South Africa, I think, or somewhere in the ocean. I don't know where it is. And I think Metal Gear Solid 5 is the weakest of all the games, simply because it doesn't have, I don't know, Kojima, in Metal Gear Solid 4, Snake was old. He's like, I'm done with this franchise, this character, everything. And so I felt he was kind of forced to make 5. I mean, 5 is a very technically great game. In terms of gameplay, it's the most advanced in the series. All the weird stuff you can do with the gameplay compilations I've seen are really, really cool, like 500 hours in Metal Gear Solid using all the decoys and whatever. It's really impressive. But because Kojima kind of admitted, I'm out of ideas, Metal Gear Solid 5 is the weakest philosophical or thematic or story out of all of them. You're basically taking from Peace Walker, where you have Chico and Paz, and they've been captured by XOF and Skullface, and you basically set up this mercenary thing, and I mean, it does kind of fit in with the idea that you're running this mercenary group that just does endless wars and are part of the the war economy. So you don't really need a good story, and really 5 doesn't have a great story. I mean, every game they have a new Metal Gear, and one was Rex, then it was Ray, then it was the Shagohod, and then it was Salanthropus, which is this upright Metal Gear that they made in the 80s. And so it's kind of nice that they do this thing where, even though it's the 80s, they have more advanced technology because they're, again, an independent mercenary group. But yeah, the story and themes, I mean, you do have certain characters where it's like the Man on Fire, I think, is like Volgan, who didn't die, I guess. And then you have like the child that grows up to be Psycho Mantis, and he has these little dolls he controls, I think. I mean, the biggest problem with Metal Gear Solid 5, it kind of gives you right off the bat, is that it breaks Metal Gear Solid tradition, where it starts out with the fantastical and works its way to the mundane. So you wake up in the hospital out of your coma, it's been 9 years, and they have this whole thing where the Man on Fire just shows up, like supernatural stuff suddenly is just happening, and you're like, okay, I guess. And then they ease into the whole mercenary aspect. So everything is reversed in this game. It feels off, it feels weird. You have to do like 50 kind of very repetitive missions. I mean, the whole open world is made to be kind of repetitive, but the way they force you to go through it, it doesn't feel like you're like in control of it, like you're not doing it for fun. The game's kind of forcing you in a way. And just the upgrade tree is so long, and like, it's cool, but there's just so much content that it feels like it was designed more so by Konami than Kojima. And sure enough, when the game finally came out, they took his name off the title. And the whole game in general just feels like it's there to exploit your time in a way. Like, you do so many missions, and it's not like you get a huge story development. It's like, there's Skullface. And I mean, the only main story thing about Metal Gear Solid 5 is actually from the song. I'm not sure when this started, but Kojima loves linking the song to the themes of the game. Definitely true of Death Stranding. I just want to mention now, because in case I forget, but if you look at the song they use, Nuclear, and you look at the album art, it's basically a cave with a bunch of handprints on it. And what do you see in the Death Stranding trailer is a bunch of handprints that are the BTs. Anyway, but the main aspect in Metal Gear Solid 5 is, for the main theme, words that kill. And so the main aspect of Metal Gear Solid 5 is that they develop a biological virus that attacks people based on the language they speak. So literally, if you speak certain words or certain languages, it will kill you. And so the whole concept behind Skullface is that he was from an unknown country that was bombed by the Americans. Sounds kind of Cambodian-ish, because that's what happened to Cambodia. They were accidentally bombed, totally destroyed, and his revenge wasn't just to seek out the ethnic cleansing of the people responsible, but because he realized they were part of a higher collective, that if you spoke that language, it was a division that he saw was the best way to take them out. So it wasn't a genetic virus, it's a linguistic virus, which is kind of insane. Kind of really cool, very sci-fi. So yeah, I don't know, there's not really much to say about 5. It's like, Skullface shows up, says, I hate American imperialism, just like Big Boss. He works for XOF, so it's like a rogue version of Foxhound, which is going to be a rogue version of the future anyway. But I guess the method that he wants to go about taking down America and the Patriots, essentially, Big Boss wants to technically create something through destruction. He wants to create a nation without borders and a place that doesn't succumb to the Patriots by making sure that it's a military style thing. He basically wants to make America, but it's in international borders. Basically, that's what he wants, and escape the same power structures that America tried to escape in the war of the Revolutionary War. And so he wants to, operate war in almost a defensive way in order to fund and create and maintain this country that he's creating in the international waters, while Skullface wants to destroy America. He wants to eviscerate it and basically destroy it as a threat entirely. And so that's why he creates this virus. And that's pretty much it. There's not much else to say about it. My favorite thing about Metal Gear Solid 5, honestly, is the hamburger monologue, how they developed the chemical burger. I think that's one of the funniest lines of little Metal Gear Solid commentary and lore and conversation and protocols I've ever heard. There's also the big twist at the end, so spoilers, but it turns out the Venom Snake is you. You gotta help us to understand the fact that Venom Snake, it's interesting because I think, they want to do this thing where they have this whole, you are the character, so all of this is technically non-canon because Big Boss does die in another thing, or I guess it's applied that Venom Snake is the Big Boss that dies in Metal Gear 1, so that it explains why, or Metal Gear 2, because Big Boss does die twice. The first Metal Gear, he dies, but then he says he comes back in Metal Gear 2, and then he really dies, and I guess that's implied that that's Venom Snake. And the Big Boss is still alive and uses that opportunity of his fake death to go into hiding and still wage his war against the higher structure of the Patriots. And so, speaking of the Patriots, I think it's a good segue to Metal Gear Solid 4. Finally, Metal Gear Solid 4 was a weird game. It was only really the only good game on the PS3 for a while. A really interesting intro along from the game installing on the system. You had Snake teaching you how to smoke a cigarette. You had these weird TV intros for fake commercials for PMC companies and fake things, and David Hayter, I think, was in one of them. And so, yeah, the intro to Metal Gear Solid 4 is interesting because it's this dynamic between, they had Follow 3 say war never changes, while Metal Gear Solid 4 says wars change. And they're saying, they're not saying anything at all. But Fallout 3 is talking about war and generality. It's like, in general, war does not change. The same conclusions come to the end and everything is destroyed. But in Metal Gear Solid 4, it's a lot more nuanced, where they have all these means of control. They have biometric scans, cortisol, adrenaline control. Everything is controlled to the point where the specifics of war have changed. Overall, they really haven't, because the main theme of Metal Gear Solid 4 is more so based in the four beauties and the beasts, where there's 4 women who are victims of different kinds of war crimes, and more so their reactions to the crimes, where it's rage, sadness, laughter, and sadness, I think, or something. And so all 4 of them are different aspects of war and how it affects people emotionally. The big thing, though, that I think links 3 to 4 is, again, like, Ocelot is the key to everything, and in this game, Ocelot is the final villain, where they kind of reference it at the end of Metal Gear Solid 2, but it was kind of a little bit weird, where essentially, this actually is the dumbest thing, where if Kojima ever wants to pull a trump card, in the way that every superhero in the past 100 years emerged because of radioactive exposure and mutated their cells, not to make them deform but to give them superpowers. The radioactive kryptonite in the Kojima universe is nanomachines. With nanomachines, anything is possible, including vampires, apparently. Anyway, so Liquid Ocelot, I have to remember this. Revolver Ocelot gets his arm sliced off, but okay, I'm trying to remember this. Sorry, Liquid Snake gets his arm sliced off and is grafted onto Ocelot's arm. No, I'm sorry. Revolver Ocelot gets his arm sliced off in Metal Gear Solid 1, and he grafts Liquid's arm onto him. Somehow the nanomachines in Liquid's arm take over his mind, and now he's Liquid Snake and also Ocelot. Ocelot is also the son of the boss and the Sorrow, and it's really interesting that essentially Ocelot is the main component for the Patriots. He's not fighting for the Patriots, but he's fighting against them. But he's also fighting against Snake because he wants to be this unilateral, entity. And he's also fighting against Major Zero, who was, the main colonel in, the 3rd game. And so you have all of these conflicting, things come together in a finale. And Kojima, of course, made Snake old because he says, I'm kind of done with the series at this point. And so what occurs is this final battle, basically, where I know it was really weird. Like, the only part of Metal Gear Solid 4 that felt like a Metal Gear game was like the very end, where you're on the tanker ship and you're sneaking around and shooting guys, and then the game just kind of ends. And you're like, oh, okay, I was enjoying myself there. It's cool that the auto camo is like adapted to the environment and all that stuff, and there's cool gimmicks with the barrel, but as a whole, Metal Gear Solid 4 feels kind of like an unfinished, weird project that really is like a love letter to the previous games. Like, you return to Shadow Moses Island and do this kind of big thing. You can actually drive Metal Gear Ray. It's actually really, really cool. But yeah, finally you have these 3 guys who are kind of coming to the final fight. All these old seniors. So you have Big Boss, who wanted his nation without borders and destroyed the Patriots. You had Major Zero, who basically helped create and consolidate the Patriots. And you have Ocelot, who is just out for himself. He wants to destroy the Patriot system as well as Snake, but again, he doesn't want to build anything in its place. He just wants to basically control the Patriots himself and replace them with his own ideology. And I think that's so interesting that Ocelot, Adam, the very character who from the beginning was the actual genetic birth of the greatest war hero, the boss, is actually the person who is the main antagonist and main threat throughout the entire game. And so, by the end of the game, Ocelot and Snake, and Ocelot sees him as like a cheap version. He sees Solid Snake as like a clone of the real war hero, and just a defective product. And again, it's that idea of the genes overcoming other genes. And so even though he's the actual son of the boss, and he's his brother, both as a clone brother and as a biological, memetic brother, because while Snake was trained by the boss, Adam was the actual offspring, and he, in the liquid part of him, was also the genetic offspring, similar to Solid Snake. And so you finally have this confrontation where, these two old guys fighting for the supremacy and freedom of the whole world have, again, a giant fist fight on top of another destroyed Metal Gear. And you even have Mei Ling come back and have her big show and all these things. But again, outside of that, there's not much to say about Metal Gear Solid 4 because it's just like the finale. It's a love letter to the fans of the game, saying this is it. This is the final chapter. And the philosophy of memes and genes don't really meet their conclusion. I mean, it's a very long game. I mean, the friggin' end cutscene felt like a little movie. It's like a few hours. And Jack Raiden finally has this epic sacrifice as well as Snake. He crawls through this microwave thing. And Raiden finally becomes this cybernetic super soldier cool thing where he finally meets Rose and his son. But then apparently in Metal Gear Rising, none of that matters. And he goes off to become like a PMC contractor despite that. But 4 is kind of like the final say. This is like the final chapter where we finish everything and everything is kind of concluded from a storytelling perspective. But from a philosophical, thematic perspective, there's not a lot of things that 4 actually adds. It's like, here's all the plot elements that are tied up in the loose ends. The guns of the Patriots, i.e. the system that controls the guns of the world, because the biometric ID scan thing is basically seized and then destroyed. And then there's this whole switcheroo with like, the big boss, but it's not the real big boss. It was actually the body of Solid Snake from 2, and the real big boss is still alive, and have this Kino epic moment with Solid Snake in this graveyard where they finally kill Zero, and I guess the Patriots are dealt with. And so it's kind of this big question mark where it's kind of like, well, I guess that's it. But of course, because the series is just too damn successful, it continues, and chronologically Metal Gear Rising, where even though the Patriots are gone now and order has been restored to the world, the war economy and the lust for war still exists, the innate human nature to recreate a system akin to that, and the struggle for power still exists, and it corrupts people's hearts, and it leads to things like child soldiers being bred to be to have their brains used in like cyber warfare bots or something, and Raiden goes to Mexico. I absolutely love all the Raiden memes. It feels like Metal Gear Rising appropriately exists in a different universe than the rest of the series, at least in terms of like memes and culture and internet humor. And I just really appreciate about that. And Raiden as a character, he's really interesting because they took that kind of motif of this being the super cybernetic 22nd century samurai and really taking it to its full kind of fruition of that idea. Also, another thing, I just think it's really badass that they have, like, the entirety of Metal Gear Rising feels like an 80s action movie. It has that energy to it. You go to some weird, remote, European location, and you fight all these guys. You have this rockin' music, and it's just, I don't know. I just really appreciate that a game made in 2013 felt like an 80s action movie with a guy who's kind of effeminate and literally wears high heels. By the way, high heels are just really interesting as like a male fashion thing. They originally started as Parisian cavalry stirrups in order to get into their horses better, and so that they didn't get knocked off the cavalry. And so it started as a male military implementation, which eventually were adopted by women in France as a fashion thing. And high heels have been part of Western culture since that advent. Outside of that, and applying that to a action hero and bringing it back to a male militaristic application, I think it's just kind of funny to me. And that Raiden is this total badass, no one questions, but he walks around in high heels. Is just, I don't know, I just think that's really cool. I think it's really funny. So yeah, again, Revengeance is kind of like Metal Gear Solid 5 in the sense that it's just rehashing a lot of old ideas, not introducing a lot of new stuff. So in Rising, Revengeance or whatever is basically like Raiden is against, again, this corporation, the new war economy, not as dangerous as the Patriots, but they want to create something like that. And so you have Sundowner and I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the Red Mist guy, the Red Mist. You know who I'm talking about. You have Mistral. And of course Armstrong. And so Sundowner's a character I really liked, but I just wanted to see more of him and his ideology. He's basically like, well, he kind of has that, it's like, after 9/11, that was the golden days when we could go to war. So he's this total war nut. I just want to see more of his twisted psyche and how he views the world, how, they can just use children's soldiers as just material and cannon fodder, essentially. And then Mistral's kind of like whatever. She's a throwaway character. She's a cool design and whatever, but she's not part of the whole, genesis of ideas. And then Red Maroon, or Red Mist, I'm going to be so embarrassed when I look up his real name, is kind of this ulterior to Jack who talks about the memes, and the memes make us who we are. Another interesting aspect, I think, of Jack's character that evolves in this title is that his nickname is Jack the Ripper, and he gets that nickname back when he eventually goes on this tirade and realizes, oh, if I actually turn off my pain inhibitors, my pain actually brings back my animalistic nature. And so that's really interesting, because Raiden has always been about the memes rather than the genes. So for him to kind of forego all of his VR training and basically rely on instinct, rely on his natural potential, kind of unlocks this new version of him, which I guess he's always shunned away from. And so the whole thing that Jack is back, it means like the true Jack is back, and you got this whole damage boost mode or whatever. But the idea is that the true self and the embrace of the body and the shunning away of technology and the embrace of the human spirit is the thing that allows him to push himself beyond the limits of just the technological limitations and abilities that he's been given by having a almost cybernetic body. And so again, it's a return to this idea of genes overcoming memes, kind of, I guess. Overall, Metal Gear Rising is just like a really solid game that everyone wants a sequel to, and it looks like it's not going to happen. And if it does happen, it's going to be a Konami project, and everyone is going to be disappointed by it. I can almost guarantee you that. Unless they get Kojima to make it, it's just not going to happen, sadly. I don't know why, but one of my favorite scenes in the entire Metal Gear Solid series is at the very end of Rising, the security guard reading like the Moe anime cartoon manga magazine, and Raiden shows up and he's all embarrassed. I don't know why that amuses me so much, but that pops into my mind. Like, I'll be doing something random, I'll just think of the security guard being like, Mr. Raiden? I'm sorry. Another really cool reference that I like is that Sunny is also in this one, and she's more grown up, and she's kind of like his AI assistant, or his tech hacker assistant. She's like tech edge basically, but she doesn't really show up for that much. So I feel like, again, Rising did so many things right, but almost didn't deliver fully on a lot of them. And of course, I forgot about Jetstream Stam, who is just his rival. He's just a good rival. I don't think there's anything about him that I can really say. Even in the DLC, Sam is just like, okay, I want to work for, U.S. World Marshal, just so I can get stronger or find out what they're doing. I don't think Sam has a very distinct moral cause. I think he just wants to be like a stronger shonen character. That's pretty much it. Which is fine, because he does that very well. I mean, everyone loves Sam. In fact, when I saw the memes of Sam, I didn't get it till I played the game. I'm like, oh, okay, this guy's he's just cool. But yeah, and the way Rising kind of ends is, again, I think the more interesting aspect actually is the other boss, which is Blade Wolf. And Blade Wolf, again, is, a robot dog-like thing. And I think it's so interesting that he's based off an animalistic dog, a very kind of like an actual animal, and yet his form is of a nature that is more wild, but his nurture and programming kind of restrains him, and his nurture restrains him to be more by the book, so to speak. And so it's a really interesting dynamic where he's trying to tap into his inner nature while trying to figure out what it is to be a real dog or be a real wolf, while Raiden is kind of doing the same thing. And the game ends again with the false flag attack with Senator Armstrong, which I now talked about. And again, that's the whole context shifting. It's the whole idea of memes overcoming, and the whole fact that Armstrong again altered his nature with nanomachines, and Raiden is able to use his human will to overtake him. And that's kind of where the chronology of the Metal Gear series ends. So that was a lot. But again, throughout the series, yes, you have all these political backdrops, the Cold War of, U.S. capitalism versus, Eastern socialism. But ultimately, it's about elevating the individual and finding their identity, despite their borders, despite their ideologies, despite the sides of the war they're fighting on. Each one of these characters have their own flaws and ideas, and all of those politics just kind of rest in the background. And Kojima doesn't tell you exactly what to think or how to think, but really he just gives you a philosophical context to, find the reason or the meaning of your life. It goes back all the way to Metal Gear Solid 1, where he says to David, you need to find your own purpose and just live. And the best is yet to come, despite the fact you might be infected with Foxdie, despite the fact that this Shadow Moses thing went off the edge, despite the fact you might be being used and abused by your government and they don't care about their soldiers and you're just another cog of the wheel and love can bloom on the battlefield and all this stuff. You still have the ability to live your life and put away and behind you all these awful things and just be a human. And that's the core tenet of Metal Gear Solid, and I'm really so grateful that the crazy Kojima made these games, because they are very cool and very decent, and I just really appreciate them. Anyway, that's pretty much all I can say about Metal Gear Solid as a series right until now. It's not just a cool military action shooter. It has some pretty decent philosophy and a wild plot that actually does kind of make sense when you really focus on Ocelot and put it all together, because he's the one strain that brings it all together. Honestly, you could redo the whole Metal Gear Solid series with Ocelot as the main character. Anyway, guys, that's pretty much all I gotta say about this one. Obviously, Metal Gear is kind of being milked and bastardized by Konami now. I mean, the remakes look good. We had the friggin' Pachinko thing, but now they're giving us the real, Metal Gear Solid Delta. But yeah, I think Metal Gear is kind of done at this point, and I'm more interested in Kojima, what he's doing with Death Stranding and whatever crazy things he does next. Anyway, guys, that's pretty much it, and thanks for watching. I'll see you later, see you next mission, and take care.